Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I interview Sarah Judd. We discuss what Sarah learned both in the classroom and as a CS curriculum writer. Sarah has experience working with CS First, Girls Who Code, and most recently with AI4ALL. Speaking of, we discuss the curriculum that Sarah continues to develop for AI4ALL and what AI4ALL is. We also discuss Sarah's advice and philosophies that can kind of guide facilitating a class or designing a curriculum or lesson. And then we share some of our concerns on discourse in gender and computer science. Near the end, Sarah asks about my approach to sustainable professional development, so I talk about Boot Up PD and what we do. If you're interested in learning more about that or any of the other resources that you find, you can check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com or by clicking in the link in the description. I hope you enjoy this conversation, which will begin with an introduction by Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a curriculum developer for open learning at AI4ALL. And then I also like to introduce some things that make me sound like a human being. So I also play cello and love theater and board games. I'm a total geek. So that's the rest of the quick introduction to Sarah.
Can you tell me the story of how you got into computer science education?
Sure. So there's two stories that kind of happened in parallel, but they don't intersect well as stories. So I'll tell them separately. One is I moved around a lot as a kid, and my first year of high school, I was in a poorer neighborhood. And for the rest of high school, I had moved to a richer neighborhood. And in the richer neighborhood, people's parents were engineers. Also, they had a first robotics team, and in order to graduate high school, you had to take a computer course. So I learned to program there and joined the first robotics team, and I fell in love. I programmed the robot. I flipped a bit in a register to make the timer work for the right amount of time, and I thought, aha, phenomenal cosmic power. I like to tell my kids that I majored in phenomenal cosmic power. Went on to WPI, majored in computer science there. While I was at WPI, I thought, well, it's entirely unfair that I had to move to this richer neighborhood in order to discover all of this. I also noticed that a lot of the people who I was in my intro class with, if you'd had computer science in high school, you stuck with computer science as your major. And if you didn't have computer science in high school, you mostly didn't. I describe this to people as sort of like if we had a bunch of math majors and some of them had taken calculus and some of them hadn't learned algebra. I always wanted to be part of bringing computer science to more people. While I was at WPI, there was a Women in Computer Science organization that a friend of mine ran. And she said, hey, Sarah, I know that you're into outreach, in particular to students that wouldn't otherwise see computer science. Would you like to be our outreach coordinator for Women in Computer Science? So I said yes. And I taught an early version of Bootstrap at citizen schools, wrote workshops teaching Girl Scouts computer science, also wrote my own Lego robotics curriculum. Back in high school, I helped mentor the Lego teams and also helped run a summer Lego camp. So I loved doing all that and applied to MIT to work with Scratch. They waitlisted me, and then, of course, nobody says no to their acceptance to the MIT Media Lab. So I wound up teaching with my computer science degree when a school mentioned, hi, Mitch from MIT recommended you to be our full-time robotics teacher. So that also sort of plays into the other part of that story, which is when I was a freshman in college, my sister was 9 years old. And she asked me to teach her to program, and I discovered Scratch. And the thing that I loved about Scratch is more than any of the other systems that I'd found to teach kids programming, as soon as my sister saw, she started actually having a goal in mind and building programs around that goal. Mm-hmm. She'd been playing with Logo before that point, and on Logo, she made turtles dance and draw things, but she didn't really have a plan for them. It's just whatever she wrote made something cool. And I appreciated that looking at Scratch gave her an idea that she wanted to make. And so she used programming to make that thing. But then we also had a brother who was approximately 2, and she wrote a program teaching him how to count. The numbers would flash across the screen saying, hello, I am number 1. Hello, I am number 2. So I really appreciated that Scratch gave her a way to have a goal in mind and learn the programming concepts through things that she actively wanted to create. So that's how I discovered Scratch and why I applied to MIT in the first place. Wound up teaching with my CS degree. I taught 4th through 8th grade at that school. I've taught 7th through 10th grade at a different school and 2nd through 7th grade last year. And then also spent some time, I worked on the Google CS First curriculum. And we started with just knowing we wanted to do something in CS education. And we had a bunch of teachers and a bunch of CS majors. And we just went into schools, saw what was happening so far, tried out different curricula that we had written. And what we landed on with CS First was something that was easy for everyone, all of us to teach, whether our background was programming or teaching. And then I wrote curriculum for Girls Who Code for a while as well. And that was in part just because it's exciting to be at the closer to the start of things. So I was helping to make the club's curriculum at Girls Who Code. That was pretty exciting for a while. And now I'm at the beginning again at AI4ALL. We just recently released the open learning curriculum, and that was mostly me thinking about how I'd want to teach AI, and I'm excited to keep releasing more modules for open learning. So there's my story, or several of them.
So if you were to write a book about your experiences in CS education, what would be some of the key things that you would discuss in each of your chapters?
So the first curriculum I worked on was through citizen schools while I was in college. It was a robotics curriculum. And my goal line for the students was get stuff done. I've since looked at this lesson plan and laughed. The people at citizen schools helped me sort of narrow that down so that students had a better idea of what I was expecting out of them in their robots and how they could make that thing. Then, the school that I taught at, that was 4th through 8th grade, everyone there taught everything. So despite the fact that I was technically their robotics teacher, I taught an awful lot of vocabulary. What we did at that school was have students memorize 30 words and their definitions. It wasn't a do you understand how to use this word quiz. It was a have you properly memorized this definition? And I definitely entered the school thinking, well, that's somewhat useless. I didn't really believe in rote memorization of that variety, nor did I think that that was a useful way to learn vocabulary. But I was very good at memorization. I have a lot of techniques up my own sleeve. And what they were able to see through this rote memorization that I didn't initially believe in, the harder you work on rote memorization, the better you'll be at it. And they could see this very clearly in rote memorization in a way that they couldn't really see it when they wrote the essays, because it's hard to write one essay and then write another essay and see that you've gotten better at writing essays. Whereas it's much easier to put an hour versus 10 minutes into rote memorization and see that you've learned more in the hour. So what I saw is they learned this on rote memorization, and then they started to do more of their homework and put more work into everything else as well. So that's what I learned from that school, was that actually there is a place, I think, for rote memorization in giving people something that they can succeed at through hard work. Then I taught at 7th through 10th grade school. I was in Worcester, and Worcester's a very diverse town. So what I learned at that school, I had given them an assignment to write a flowchart to teach someone how to dance. And the key part here was I didn't tell them what the dance was. I didn't say aha, you're Puerto Rican, teach us how to salsa or something. I said, okay, so teach us all how to dance in a whatever dance interests you. And that really sparked their interests. A lot of the students who I hadn't seen be interested before that point loved that assignment. And I thought, coming off of the success of that, there's a bunch of culturally situated design tools, as I believe what they're called, that come out of RPI. And one of them was using iteration to make cornrow curls. So I did that. And that felt to my students much more like I thought, aha, you're African American, you will be interested in this lesson. And they looked at me like, what's this white lady doing teaching us about cornrow curls? I think there's definitely very good ways to bring those culturally situated design tools into your class, and I had done it pretty clumsily. But what I learned from this and from the difference in those two lessons, I, as the teacher, do not get to define for you, the student, what your culture is. You'll engage more students if you let them take their culture to you, but you should let them take what bits of their culture they want to take to you, rather than you being the gifting teacher telling them what their culture is and being glad that you brought it into their classroom. So that is the main thing I learned at that school. Also at that school, I reached out to people I found online who taught computer science in urban districts. And one of those people was Joanna Good, who's, I believe, at University of Oregon. She suggested that role models are super important and that I find ways to bring role models that look like my students into the classroom. And if you've looked at the Google CS First curriculum or the Girls Who Code curriculum or the AI4ALL curriculum, you will see that all of them really highlight role models. It is super powerful to find a human that you can associate yourself with doing something that you might want to do. So this can be like racial or ethnicity or gender-wise people that you associate with. It can also be like dancers. I try to, in all of my curricula, bring diverse role models in terms of what it is they're doing, what it is their background is, and then also race, gender, etc., so that any given student can find something to latch onto and say, people like me do this thing. Sidebar. I also think that that's important for people not like me. I want for students to see that people not like them program. That is also super powerful. I don't want the first person not like you who you meet who programs to be someone that you work with. The importance of role models is also something that I started learning while I was at the school for 7th through 10th graders.
And I appreciate that you bring up something beyond heritable traits, because far too often the focus on role models is an identity that you have no control over. You just are born into that.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate that you're bringing up stuff outside of that, because it's one thing to identify with something you have no control over. It's another thing to identify with, oh, here's an interest of mine. This person also has that same interest, and I can connect with them on that level, rather than just these surface level things that you have no control over.
Well, exactly. Different people also identify with different things. So, like, you can assume that someone must identify with their, like, gender is one of the more common ones. Let's show more women doing things. But certainly Sarah, as a young child, would not have been excited by more women doing things. Sarah is excited by more musicians doing things.
Right.
There's a lot of different hooks for people. Different things are salient to different people's identity.
Yep. And sorry, I interrupted your...
No worries. It's a good sidebar. So yeah, then I guess I'd have a chapter for Google CS First. One of the things that CS First really brought out for me was the importance of creating things. I love puzzles. If you give me a bunch of programming puzzles, I will be excited for days. But I know lots of people who are not excited by puzzles, who are excited by making things and having something tangible that they can share with their friends afterwards. And people who like puzzles will definitely run into puzzles while they're creating things, whereas people who are into creating things will not necessarily always run into that while what they're doing is puzzles. So that was one of the things that the Google CS First curriculum focused on, was every single day you are making something. And that was something we learned from going into classes and watching students and seeing what worked.
Mm-hmm.
Creation is super important. This is also something which you will now start seeing in every curricula that happens from me hereafter. So that includes the Girls Who Code curriculum, which is where I went next. At Girls Who Code, there is some Women in Tech spotlight at the beginning of every lesson. So you have lots of diverse people, all women because Girls Who Code, who are doing cool things in tech. Everything we teach you, we then have you make something for. The club's curriculum is focused in the beginning around, we're going to make a website that contains a bunch of projects, like Scratch projects maybe, or website project, or whatever you're using to express something you care about in the world. So it has the creation, it has the role models. Also, one of the important things about Girls Who Code is talking about gender. So at Girls Who Code, a lot of people, when I worked there, a lot of people would ask me, well, what have you done for the Girls Who Code curriculum that you wouldn't have done for a co-ed curriculum? And for co-ed curriculum, I still use role models. They're not all women in tech. But otherwise, absolutely everything I did for the Girls Who Code curriculum, I would have done for a co-ed curriculum. I think it is important when we talk about including more girls in computer science education that we don't, while we do that, define what it means to be a girl. That, oh, well, girls like to change the world, whereas boys like to make video games or something.
Right.
I think, people like to change the world and people like to create video games. And say we really need to sort of detach those notions, which was a thing I thought a lot about while I was at Girls Who Code. Yes, this curriculum was for an organization that was explicitly about encouraging more girls in tech. That doesn't change the way you think about what it is you're making. And then last year, I taught 2nd through 7th grade. In that school, absolutely everyone had to go to my class. It was the way a lot of music or art classes are in elementary school. So they saw me twice a week for 35 minutes a session. And I had them make projects and all the things that I was just describing, lots of role models, lots of creation. And they sort of often stared at me blankly. What I decided was, in part, this is coming from the previous places I'd been, had been about clubs and about students who wanted to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And this was students who had to be there. And it felt less like a place that students could feel motivated to bring their whole selves to. School adds a whole bunch of like being cool and also getting grades and all of like, there's a whole lot of layers there. And so what I started to learn to do was still give them projects, but also have up my sleeve more directions for them and more like, okay, if it is very important to you not to show that you care about this thing, here is exactly what you need to do to get the A, which sometimes was more motivating for them. So I had my 7th graders create Lego robots for kindergartners, and they read what the kindergartners wanted in toys and then designed their own toy. And then they went down to the kindergartners and showed them their toys and got feedback. And I asked them if they wanted to keep working on their toys. And so the way I initially did this was I said, raise your hand if you'd like to keep working on your toys. Okay, raise your hand if you'd like us to move on to web development for the last month of the school year. Got no hands at all. And then I said, okay, actually, everybody, put your heads down. Nobody can see you. And they all put their heads down. And I said, okay, now raise your hand if you would like to keep working on your toy. All but 2 students. So it was very much a position of, you're in 7th grade, you can't show the passion that is there. So I kind of tried as the year went on to give my students outs where they didn't have to show that they were being excited about the projects, but still had something that might excite them to work on.
Having taught at classes that are elective and then worked with classes that are mandatory for all students, you have to approach them differently, in my opinion. I mean, you can't go in assuming that there's a buy-in when a kid is required to be there X number of hours per semester.
And also, there's all the students who haven't bought in who are also there. So even if you would have bought in 7th grade, it's really important to look like you didn't. I also ran a robotics club. During the robotics club, they were all bought in, and they were bought in the whole time, and they were way more bought in than they were bought into the same exact concepts during class.
Yeah, the social pressures definitely impact what goes on, whether it's choosing to look engaged or not engaged, or even just to be in the classroom or not be in the classroom.
I guess the current last chapter in that book, and almost certainly not the last chapter, is AI4ALL. Cool thing about AI4ALL is it's in AI education, and I feel like AI education is a brand new frontier for K-12 in particular. It feels like where CS education was a decade ago. We're still learning what we want it to look like, and it's pretty exciting to be at the beginning of that. And that's, I guess, the book so far.
To be continued.
Yes.
So how would you describe the curriculum you're designing for AI for All?
The most important thing that I've been thinking about the whole time is keeping it student-centered. We describe AI in a way that people from lots of big different backgrounds find interesting. We give them AI used in art and music, also AI used in medicine, and those are the ones I remember off the top of my head, but there are lots. We have discussions, activities, and readings. So there's lots of different ways to engage with the material. We highlight lots of diverse role models doing those different things. We also, for all of the projects at the end, offer student choice in terms of what they're interested in researching further. So the very final project in the Explore AI curriculum, Explore AI is the first module of open learning. The very last project involves students picking an area that matters to them and then thinking about how AI can affect that field in 5 to 10 years. So the example I always give, I happen to have been watching figure skating when I came up with this project. Maybe there's a world in the future where AI watches videos of figure skaters and scores them. And what does that mean to how people figure skate? Does it change what sorts of things people will do to make sure that the AI sees it? What does it mean about jobs after you're finished figure skating now that judge is no longer an open one, things like that. So the very idea is you've picked something that matters to you to think about AI with, rather than me picking something that matters to me. Also important to note, it's free and it's available to anyone online who finds it. You do fill out a survey to begin with, just so we know we have some idea of who has seen the curriculum. It's also fairly flexible. We'll be releasing lots of different modular curriculum eventually, but we started with just this first one, Explore AI, and each module has different options of how to use it. So Explore AI has either a 10, 20, or 30-hour curricula based on how much time you have in your class. And they all just build on each other. So if you thought you only had 10 hours and it turns out you want to teach the full 30 hours, works for me. So we're thinking very much about how to make it easy to run in whatever setting you're in. So that could be a workshop setting or an after-school setting or in school. We have different teachers who are working with it at all those different levels. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what Explore AI has for its units, so you can get an idea of what we think is important. Explore AI, which is our first module, doesn't involve any math or any programming. It is a conceptual discussion-based class. Future modules will involve programming, but we're going to take you through it slowly.
And what's the target age?
Oh, yeah, high school students.
Okay.
So the units for Explore AI, it starts with just what is AI, what impact is it having, and lots of different examples, both from us and from the kids. Some discussion of the future and what predictions people made about AI in the 60s that turned out haven't happened yet and why those haven't happened. Strong versus weak AI, why Terminator is unlikely, things like that. And then the second unit is on data. So it starts by students thinking about how they learn and how they figure out, oh, this was wrong. How do I change my model of how the world works? And then comparing that to a high-level overview of how machines can learn. And then machines are learning from data, much like humans. Lots and lots of data. And so where's that data coming from? And students learn in part that they're where a lot of the data is coming from. And how do they feel about that? And how much did they realize that they were a source of data? Knowing that data comes from humans, start to think about, well, human bias has entered this data. Sometimes there's not a representative sample of humans have gone into this data. And that leads to sort of talking about algorithmic bias. And then that ends with the students researching algorithmic bias in whatever algorithm interests them. And then unit 3 is career paths. So I give them a lot of different people who are involved in AI, data science, AI ethicists, researchers. And then I end with the people who write the dialogue for Cortana, because a lot of people wouldn't realize that, well, it's someone's job to do that. And the people who do that for Cortana are, for instance, a poet and a comedy writer. And then they end that unit by imagining their own career path. Having looked at all of these other career paths, what they'd need to study in order to get a job that would interest them in AI. Unit 4 is community vision. It's a project where the students go out into their community and see what their community knows about AI, where maybe their community's gaps in AI knowledge are, and then how they could fill those gaps now that they know these things. So they first interview a lot of people and then take what they've learned to come up with, well, how could we be people who teach about AI now that we know about it? And then the final project I've already described. It's a project where you imagine what AI might do in the future based on an interest of yours. So let's explore AI, which is the first module of many modules soon to come. I'm currently working on one that is on sentiment analysis, where students are going to think about bias in articles and also create a program that can check different articles. That's the curriculum so far.
That sounds fascinating and very topical in terms of like its relevancy.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for. The main overarching goal of particularly Explore AI is increasingly part of the world. It's in part of everyone's world. And I want students to know how it works, how they can be a part of it. I want when AOC says something about algorithmic bias, I want people to go, this is what she means, and not the response she got, which was a lot of people saying, well, algorithms are never biased. Like, I think it's increasingly important living in our world to know what AI does. And that's what the Explore AI curriculum was written for.
And how do you respond to the people who associate AI with, like you mentioned, Terminator or The Matrix?
Yeah, so there are lots of things to be scared about with AI. And then there are some things not to be scared about with AI, and those are the things people are scared about. One of the things I explain, we are very, very far from what's called strong AI, which is super generalizable AI. We are doing an excellent job building things that are very good at a specific task. So, for instance, a self-driving car is getting pretty good at driving city streets. If you instead plopped that car into a monster truck rally, it would not know what to do. Whereas a human who has learned to drive on city streets, probably still monster truck rally, much harder. Don't necessarily know all the skills for a monster truck rally, but could deal with it.
Right.
Terminator can deal with it. We are nowhere near understanding how to make something that can do that. While we do have an awful lot more AI around us, and we're doing a lot of things that even 5 years ago seemed harder, all of those things are very specific. Like the program on your phone that understands what you're saying when you say it and can parse English is an entirely different program than the program on your phone that suggests a time to meet. When all of those things are exactly one program, then we will be close to Terminator. But we are nowhere near that in terms of what we can do now.
You've mentioned algorithmic bias, and that's been a rightful topic of discussion in recent years. I'm wondering what kind of questions you might ask people who are working on AI, but who aren't necessarily thinking through the consequences or outcomes of the AI that they're developing.
I have a bias in terms of where I think that comes from. And that's part of what I'm working on with this curriculum and with most curricula that I work on. We tend to teach programmers how to program. Super focused on that. And then often you have to maybe take an ethics class, but it's somewhere to the side. And it's something that you have to have on your school record in order to get a diploma, but it's this other thing. Whereas ethics and impact are really part and parcel of everything that you do. So I think that when you're building programming curriculum and AI curriculum, you need to make sure that you are putting in, where you is me, the me's of the world, are putting in not only just how to make things happen, but why, and thinking about who your programs are going to affect and how you can minimize that impact and things like that. So I think the important thing is to build more people who this question does not apply for. Build more people who are thinking about what the consequences or outcomes of AI are. And I think that the way you do that is to make sure that thinking about the consequences and outcomes and algorithmic bias and ethical issues are all part of thinking about how do you make this happen. And then also just giving people time. I think that's another thing that happens a lot is we focus on getting stuff done. The focus needs to be not just on what is done, but also what the impact therein is.
Some of the arguments that I've heard from people is, well, if I don't do it, then somebody else is. A lot of that has to go with the unsaid statement behind the move fast and break things mentality is to move fast and break things in order to make a lot of money, as opposed to in order to help a lot of people. And I really wish it was reframed the second way rather than the first way, where it's all about capital gain and whatnot, as opposed to trying to help the most amount of people possible, as opposed to your own pocketbooks. But I know that's my own bent on that topic.
It's an important one to have. We don't just make things, we make things for people. And remembering that there's the for people in that, as opposed to, I don't know, for the company, is super important.
Yeah, I listened to a podcast, I think it was a Rich Roll podcast. They're interviewing somebody who was talking about sustainable farming efforts and how right now there's this trend to do these farming practices that give you a really high amount of yield over the next few years or even decade. But in 100 years, the land will be you can't grow anything on it. Whereas if you were to go for a smaller amount of yield now, and then over 100 years, you'll have more production and whatnot, and the land will still be fertile. But right now, our focus tends to be more on the short-term game rather than how is this going to impact people down the road.
Yeah. Can't tell because this is a podcast, but I'm nodding a lot.
What do you want people to know about AI4ALL that might not be understood just by looking at the website?
I think the website's pretty good at sharing the things I was describing above about how student-centered it is and project-based and all of that. What I think it doesn't show quite as much, I have been a teacher, and the people who I was working with this curriculum on have also been teachers. And so we were thinking a lot also about the teacher experience and how to give teachers enough resources in their super busy schedules to be able to be comfortable and confident teaching the curriculum.
Yeah, and no disrespect to any well-intentioned computer scientists who develop curricula, but I really think you need to have experience in a classroom actually trying out things with kids to actually be able to develop useful resources that are going to help a wide range of people.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's very easy to get on your high horse and think that you know things, and then you have to see them in front of 20 fifth graders. It's entirely different.
Yeah, all you need is that one kid who just flat out refuses to do something that you planned that was well-intentioned to go, oh, I perhaps need to try multiple methods.
Exactly. Yep.
I don't know, teaching's one of those professions where you grow up with it, most likely if you go in through K-12 and higher education experiences, seeing it for decades. And so you assume what's going on, but you don't know the thought processes behind what a teacher is actually doing in a classroom. So you just make assumptions that often are not in alignment with what's actually going on in the head of the person who's teaching a class.
Yep. There could be a whole podcast just on what people think teaching is like versus what teaching is like.
I'd listen to that. That'd be interesting. If someone were to walk into your ideal computer science classroom, what would they see, hear, or experience?
So I'm very much in CS education because I thought programming was fun. What I hope if someone walked into a CS classroom, they would see the fun. And some of that is in kids being excited about what they're working on and being comfortable enough that sometimes things are breaking. And rather than being frustrated by this, the kids are excited to figure out how to fix it. The kids are mostly helping each other. One of my favorite classes, I taught 2nd through 7th grade last year. I had a 2nd grade class where the kids were almost never in just one seat. They kept grouping based on what puzzles they were working on.
Right.
When one person got stuck, another person would excitedly go over to help them figure things out. Also very supportive in that way. The kids believe in each other and are not afraid of when they are not doing well, but are excited to learn from their peers.
Mm-hmm.
And they're making things preferably that not just the teacher sees. I mentioned the 7th graders were making robots for the kindergartners.
Right.
And that was a whole kind of powerful that anything else they'd done all year had not quite hit. Like I had them make a dance party where their robots were dancing for each other, and they had fun with that. But it's entirely different to watch a kindergartner's eyes light up because they pressed a button and the dog barked. And having that real authentic audience is something that I think is important.
Yeah, both inside and outside of the school community itself. If there's a way that you can share beyond the walls of your classroom, highly recommend that.
Yes. It makes people outside of your classroom more excited that your classroom exists, and that's very useful.
Yeah. What are some of the philosophies or pedagogies or experiences that kind of inform your approach?
Bell Hooks, Teaching to Transgress. I think the book starts with no education is politically neutral. If you think that you're being neutral, what you are doing is continuing power structures. So I always try to be aware of lots of different kinds of oppression so that I can help students in my class that are dealing with varying different kinds of oppression. So not ever making assumptions, and also learning as much as you can about the world. In that general line, pedagogy of the oppressed, of course, everyone brings up.
Which is Paulo Freire,
Yeah,
by
Paulo
the way.
Freire. Yes.
I'll put it in the show notes.
So in pedagogy of the oppressed, it's mostly talking about their own liberation through education, allowing your students to bring themselves as them into the classroom and not thinking of them as empty vessels for you to fill, but as like a whole together. Some other things. I very much believe that whether you think your students can or can't succeed, you will be correct. If a student has decided for whatever reason that they are not going to participate or something in your class and you give up on that student, they're definitely not participating in your class. Whereas if you actively believe in them and continue to follow them, my experience is oftentimes that's part of what they're looking for is do you believe in them? One of the most effective things I did last year, I had almost 400 students. But for some students, I would call them out of a free period and sit down and say, okay, something in our relationship is not working. Something in this class is not working for you. I want to give us some time just to get to know each other and to help me understand how to make this class better for you. And students heard themselves being heard when I did this. Worked for most of them. It was important not just to listen to their voice, but to have them realize that I was taking my free period to listen to their voice. And then even if really not that much about the class changed, the way we saw each other changed. So just making sure your students hear you listening to them.
I think that approach really pays off, especially if you see kids year after year, because you have this connection that crosses school calendar years that a lot of teachers don't get. So like when I taught music, I saw kids for multiple years in a row from when they were third grade up through fourth, fifth, sixth, etc. And a lot of classroom teachers don't get that experience. So if a kid doesn't buy into whatever it is you're teaching over that year, if you have multiple years to like just consistently demonstrate that you actually care about them and who they are as a person and what they're interested in, then eventually, usually they understand and learn to trust you in most scenarios, in my opinion. And I think that's an advantage that we have over classroom teachers who see a kid for 1 year and that's it.
Yeah, you really get to watch them grow up and sort of like grow with them.
So what are some of the things that you wish you knew when you started teaching CS that you would recommend for new CS educators?
The first thing I always recommend to new CS educators is to be on Twitter. When you're usually, as a CS educator, the only one in your school, sometimes the only one in a district, you are definitely not the only computer science teacher. There's more and more of us out here.
Yep.
The easiest place I found to connect to people was Twitter. If you're in K8 CS education, there's CSK8, which is at 8 p.m. every other Wednesday. Design thinking in K-12, which is on Thursdays. You can run into other people doing things you do. And then once you start following those hashtags and such, then you start finding people you can talk to more directly. You're not alone. Please contact me if you think you're alone. That is the first thing I always tell people.
Part of the reason why I went with CSK8 as the name of the podcast was to try and help people realize that there is a community out there. And so every time in the show notes, I include a link to just the general hashtag on Twitter, just to show like, here's the most recent dialogue that's happened over the last week.
Yes.
I think I agree with you. I think it's very important to know that there are other people out there, especially if you feel like, well, I'm the only person in this building or even in this school or district or whatever that's doing this one subject area.
Yes. I remember the other thing that I said.
Mm-hmm.
Co-curricular teachers. At my school, I was a co-curricular teacher. You might not be. But one of the things that CS teachers have a hard time with is figuring out, well, these projects are creative. How do I work with a class that's working on 5 different creative projects at any given time? How do I go about grading this or whatever? Co-curricular teachers are already doing the things that you're doing. So talking to the music teachers and the art teachers and such about how are they getting students to express themselves while still learning the content that they need to learn? How are they helping their students work collaboratively and creatively?
Yeah, and I love how you phrase that as asking how they are getting kids to express themselves and learn the concepts. Far too often, it's how can I use X subject area for my own gain? And I have found that to be problematic whenever looking at integrated or interdisciplinary discussions.
Also very true.
Okay, so we've talked about some of your considerations for a classroom, but what about for developing an engaging learning experience for kids, whether it be a lesson or a full curriculum?
So I think the number one thing is never make assumptions. It's a somewhat hard line to walk between giving students enough options that they can find something that works for them and giving students too many options such that they're overwhelmed with choice. I tend to lean closer to the overwhelmed with choice because I feel like as a teacher, you can know your students well enough to narrow that for me, whereas I'm usually writing for who knows who. But yeah, making a curricula that has lots of different entry points, gives as many different ways to show your knowledge as possible and to obtain the knowledge as possible.
Yep.
Lots of UDL, Universal Design for Learning. Yeah, because I don't actually know what is engaging for you. For some students, it will definitely be building projects. And for some students, it actually won't. Giving students room for whatever that is. One of my favorite stories from last year follows along this line. I had a student who I'd first just let them create a Scratch project about anything just to see what they'd come up with. This kid had been very engaged and built the whole thing about cars. And then the next thing was I taught them some more storytelling elements and things that you could do in Scratch for storytelling in the intervening time each day while they were working on this project. And so I had them make another story. And since in 4th grade they learned about the Greek myths, I had them make a Greek myth story on Scratch. And this kid said, "Oh, I wanted to do things about cars." And I said, "Well, that's fine. The Greek gods can ride cars." And the kid goes, "Oh, Zeus would ride a Koenigsegg because he's the king of the gods." And I said, "Oh, yes, that is the kind of car that I would imagine Zeus would drive." And so then he got super into this project on writing a Greek myth because the gods could ride cars. So I think finding what's important in this and how can I make it something that a kid will be excited about. It certainly wasn't important that the Greek gods not ride cars. You can totally tell a full Greek myth while the gods are riding cars.
Yeah, I really loved the point about what's important in this. Far too often when I look at a rubric, if you were to just, from an objective standpoint, kind of see, well, what is being assessed here? It's usually what the theme is and counting the number of things inside of a project rather than focusing in on the concept or practice itself. That's important. That can be applied to a billion different types of projects.
Yep. Yeah. What is it you actually wanted your students to get out of doing this project? Make sure it has that thing and don't bog them down in everything else.
Right. Yeah. Although some administrators, they want to see everybody learning the same things. And yeah, so that can lead into some interesting discussions. What questions have I not asked that you would like to discuss?
So I brought up a little bit earlier when I was talking about Girls Who Code, the idea of being inclusive, particularly of girls. When we start talking about that, we talk in ways that are problematically essentialist. So I'm going to define that term in a moment. Gender essentialism is this idea that because of the gender you were assigned at birth, usually boy or girl, you will have particular interests and particular ways that you like to express yourself. And in the CS Ed community, we want to be more welcoming to girls, generally. And once we start talking about that, we have, at the very least, decided that, well, making everything pink is definitely not being more welcoming to girls. Girls are not just pink. And we have, at the very least, I think, as generally a CS education community, stopped doing that. But we do still have this basic idea that girls want to change the world. And girls like to tell stories and, are more artistic or whatever. And it is certainly true that CS education in the past had not valued enough how artistic and expressive and world changing computer science could be. And it is certainly important that we tell all students that CS is world changing and creative and artistic and all of those things, because there are boys who are less interested in CS because they didn't realize that they could change the world with it. And then I also think it is super important that there are girls who like video games and sci-fi and geeky things. As someone who frequently walked into CS classrooms and looked around and saw, mostly boys, I would feel intimidated by those classes and have stereotype threat thoughts along the lines of, I can't ask questions because I would prove to people that people who aren't boys are not as good at this. So I would be terrified of asking questions.
Right.
But I'm a sci-fi loving competitive geek. And I always described it to people as I'm far more of a geek than I ever was a girl. In fact, it was the fact that computer science classrooms were frequently places that were full of sci-fi loving geeks that made me feel at home. And every CS education conference I have ever been to has told me, well, you're weird, and that's why you're here. But girls don't like those things and need you to do these other things. And there is a large extent where that feels like erasure of many girls who do like these things, and in what it means to be a girl, and in what it means to be a boy, and also in the fact that you'll have students that are neither girls nor boys. There's lots of non-binary people. And if we continue to talk in this way about girls wanting to save the world and boys wanting to make video games and being geeky, we have defined what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl. And I think what we are trying to do is to stop defining what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl, and to instead make the computer science space more open to everyone, regardless of what their interests are and regardless of how they identify gender-wise. So I think it is super important that we as computer science teachers stop using gendered language. More students will be interested if we bring the storytelling into our CS classrooms. More musicians will be interested if we show students that AI can use music, right? We don't need to say more girls will blah, blah, blah. And this is generally my rant as someone who at this point in life identifies as non-binary, but for quite some time identified as, girl in tech, and kept hearing oh, no. Girls don't like sci-fi, etc., etc. Please don't do that to your children. You are totally erasing people's identities and who they are, and what you are meaning to be doing is the reverse. So let's be more inclusive of all people who are interested in things that are not traditionally what we associate with tech, and stop making that about a given gender per se. And in the meantime, do invite more people who you assume to be girls into your classroom. Do invite people. Do make sure that you are not using gendered language generally. Some of the things that we do to try to encourage girls will in fact encourage more people in general if we stop doing this whole thing where we have assigned what girls like. I think end rant.
Yeah, I kind of fear that. So right now, there's not a lot of discussion on people who identify outside of the binary. in education. Like a lot of research, they don't even ask those questions, which is a whole different topic. But I kind of fear that, okay, if it is discussed now, okay, there are male, there are female, and then there are people who identify outside of that categorization. I fear that they will essentialize non-binary individuals as yourself and myself into, okay, well, girls like this, boys like this, non-binary kids will probably like this. And I know it's all
Yes.
well-intentioned, like in terms of they mean the best. When some people ask me the curriculum that I developed for Boot Up, like, okay, well, what projects are really good for girls? And I'll bring up this some examples where, okay, in the classes that I worked with, there were kids who were working on this project that was basically a dress-up game, in that they created this thing where you could click on the different articles of clothing and then it would create a different costume for this character. And who engaged in that? Well, it was boys, actually. And then,
Yes.
okay, well, there was this car game that was like, it was a race car game, and these kids added in stuff like different turbo boosts, and like, if you drive into the grass, it slows you down, and like oil slicks and things like that. And who engaged in that? Well, girls did, actually.
Yes.
I try and bring up those examples to say, like, those are typically associated with an essentialization of the opposite gender of what actually engaged in them. So the projects that I create, I say, okay, I take into account different identities in terms of interests, but I'm not going with these heritable assumptions and saying, okay, I assume boys will like this project, girls will like this project, and non-binaries will like this project. But just go with, well, kids who are interested in dance would probably like this dance project. Kids who are interested in music would probably like this music project.
Absolutely.
I know it's kind of a non-answer that people are looking for, but it's the truth. Like, based on my experience in the classroom and my experience as a curriculum developer, that's just what I've learned to go with.
And you make more people feel welcome.
Right.
If you are assuming, well, people who are interested in race cars are going to build this race car project, then if you are assuming boys are going to be interested in this race car project, well, then, like, if you're not a boy and you were interested in the race car project, suddenly you're not anymore.
Right. And I'm curious more from a social perspective of, why is it that certain identities or groups of individuals are more or less interested in some areas? And then even from a broader perspective, why is it that we as a society care when there's an imbalance in different identities in some areas and not in others? So in computer science, a big topic is getting more girls and women in computer science education. Cool. I'm all for that. No problem with that. But I'm wondering, why is there not an outcry for getting more males into elementary education when around 80% of teachers are female, according to statistics in the last few years? Like, why is it that that's not an outcry?
And like, there's a lot of research that shows that it's generally better for students to have had more gender and racial diversity in the classroom in elementary school.
Yeah, and racial is around the same amount. It's like 80% of teachers are white across the board, in at least in America. And I just find it fascinating. Like, I understand that women are seen as like within a marginalized culture, like in terms of America is generally considered to be a male-dominated society when it comes to capitalism and whatnot. And so I understand wanting to argue for equity and balance among identities, especially when it comes to gender. But why is it that we focus on some and then ignore others when it kind of favors a marginalized group? To me, it's just kind of like, it blurs the, what are you getting at here? Is it the issue that diversity is a problem, or is it the issue that in this scenario, a marginalized group is not represented equally, but we don't care about it in others? It's just kind of a question that I'm posing.
I think one of the things that goes on there is also problematic in its own right, which is that, like, we value tech in the way that we don't value teaching. So we therefore value talking about, at least, diversity in tech more than we value talking about diversity in teaching.
I feel like you and I could probably turn this into an entire podcast episode on its own. So I'll just kind of end my rant here and completely switch directions with questions. Okay, so given the pressures and demands of working in the field of education, how do you take care of yourself or stave off burnout?
Yeah, very good question. So there is a certain extent where I could say, of course, you think about the kids and you care about the kids and that makes it all worth it. But I feel like this means that we weaponize the kids. And when you're feeling burnout and someone says, well, I mean, we're doing it for the kids, what you hear is, oh shoot, I do not love my kids enough. More burnout. I mean, there is some amount of that. Certainly there were, like, I kept letters that my kids sent me with thank yous on them, or particular projects that I was proud of the kids for doing, and I would look at them when I needed reminders of why I was doing this thing.
Yep.
Also, I think it is super important that everyone remember about teachers that we are also human beings. In tech, there is this idea that you should have a GitHub that is full of all the programming you also do in your free time. And we also have this idea that that is toxic and we shouldn't require this of people. I think more people need to realize that, like, teachers also need to live their human lives, and that that's okay. I read an article once during one of the teacher strikes, which was someone saying, it turns out students don't actually perform better if their teachers have better salaries. And my thoughts on the matter were, but are the teachers happier? Because it turns out we too are human beings, and maybe better salaries is not just about student performance, and is in part about teachers living reasonable lives.
Right. Yeah. No, I think those are all really good points. I have what I call a happy file in my filing cabinet that's like the cards that kids used to make and like things like that I'll just go back and look through. I have one where it's like the card, it's actually in the photos that's on my CV page for my website. Like underneath it, there's this card that this kid made that like the words says, "You are the funniest teacher ever." And then it's a stick figure person with like just a flat smile, like just like a straight line across. Just like, that pretty much summarizes me. Like, kids think I'm funny, but I look like I'm not. So what do you wish there was more research on that can inform your practices or the field?
I mean, the quick answer is everything. More research. Please send. I think this is science writing and research in general. More repeat studies, like verification studies. Please tell me all the null like the studies that didn't work, and studies that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, and like what we're thinking about generalizing there.
Yeah, that's a pretty big problem in academia, is the idea that you need to be doing original stuff, so then people will cite you, and it needs to be a positive effect, because otherwise people won't cite you, etc. So.
Right, yeah. Sometimes things don't work. And sometimes they're even things with popular names.
Right. Yeah, far too often people think, oh, well, it worked this one time, so therefore it should work in all other user scenarios.
We need to put it in every single school, in every teacher's classroom.
Right. What questions do you have for myself or the field?
So I'd love to hear more about, one of the things I love about Boot Up is that it's not one and done style PD, and I'd love to hear more about like what teachers are feeling and thinking, and what teachers feel like they need.
Yeah, so I could talk for hours about that topic. So I'll kind of give like a high level overview of what we're doing and why we're doing it that way. So what we offer is around 50 hours of PD, and we recommend spreading it out between 2 and 3 years. So what typically would happen is maybe the first year we'll come out once per quarter to do a 6-hour PD session. And we'll do that for 2 years straight, let's say. And in those times when we come out there, we will, if the PD's on like a Wednesday, we'll come out on like Tuesday and Thursday to do site visits and model teaching and peer observations and things like that. So the reason why we're doing this is because we feel that a workshop model that kind of like front loads everything at the start of the year, and then you might not get anything ever again, or you might not get anything for a year, doesn't take into account the fact that you're going to try and implement some stuff, and odds are you're going to have some questions or want some clarifications after that. So what we'll do with the PD is, okay, here's some stuff that'll get you started. You can take this very next day and start working on it. And we give you enough content that you're going to be busy for a long time, or can be at least, in terms of projects and lessons. But when we come back, let's say a month or two from now, you're going to have some questions, so feel free to ask them, and we'll kind of unpack them more, and then we'll go a little bit further and dive a little bit deeper. Rather than overwhelming you with learning multiple programming languages and platforms and learning the pedagogy behind how to implement them and thinking about, okay, how do we connect these into other content areas and blah, blah, blah. Like the way computer science education and coding in particular is typically taught from a professional development standpoint is we're asking you to teach something in, let's say, Mandarin, but you've never heard, seen, or spoken Mandarin before, ever, in any kind of scenario. And we want you to, by the way, integrate that Mandarin into other content areas. And that's going to be a little bit difficult to do, especially if, okay, we're going to teach you as much Mandarin as possible in a week, and then have fun. You should be good for the rest of your teaching career with doing that. It's just not going to go well, in my opinion. So we like to distribute it throughout at least 1 year, preferably 2 or more years. We like to do the site visits and the model teaching because sometimes when we're modeling stuff in a PD, some teachers are like, yeah, but I don't know if this would work well with my kids. Like when we talk about choice-based and facilitation practices and things like that. And so when we actually go into the classroom and show, okay, here's what this looks like with your kids, then for some teachers, they go, oh, it can be done. I can actually do this thing because now I've seen my kids do it really well. The peer observation stuff that we do is helpful because teachers need to learn from each other. So we recommend like recording other lessons and kind of sharing that and discussing it. Oh, why did you do it this way? Or how did you do it this way? It's just a good PLC, professional learning community kind of thing to do. One of the things that we also like to do with our professional development is have an instructional coach for the district. And that's kind of the person who's going to oversee what's going on in terms of the implementation and kind of be the in-house guide for the current and future teachers. Because what we want to do is make the program sustainable. So when we leave in 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 years, we don't want you to ever have to call us back up and go, okay, we need to do that same thing that you did, and you're going to do it with this new cohort of teachers. So as we're going through the PD process, our PD facilitators will do this gradual release where by our 3rd PD, the instructional coach is going to be like help facilitating and asking questions and leading projects. And then by the final PD, the coach should be able to kind of run the PD sessions on their own because we want it to be sustainable and we want to make it so that a district can continue to learn and stay up to date with computer science education by the time we leave. So that's kind of like a higher level, our main things that we do.
Yeah, I particularly love that idea that like you're going to, as you teach this stuff, have more questions.
Right.
So being there when the more questions pop up is particularly useful.
Yeah, to know that you have that support is important for a lot of teachers. So we've done independent research on like self-efficacy of the teachers and whatnot to ensure that they are feeling more confident in what they're doing and that they are more comfortable with teaching the subject area. Because for most of the teachers that we work with, it's a subject area that they've never even seen before. And it's this scary thing that gets overhyped and people think, oh, well, only certain kinds of people can do programming. I can't do programming because I've never done it before. And it's like, well, I mean, if we can get kindergartners to do it, then certainly we can help you how to do it. Did I answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Okay. Thank you.
Where might people go to connect with you and the organizations you work with?
So the easy answer to that question, OLP, which is just Open Learning Program, .ai4all.org is where you'll find the Open Learning curriculum. You'll need to register, just register with the Code Explorer, and then you'll be able to see all the curriculum. There's also just AI-4-all.org in general, which is our website. You can contact me at Sarah, SARAH, at AI-4-all.org. I'm fairly active on Twitter, so if you message me there and / or follow me there, you'll see a lot of thoughts on CS education. So my Twitter is just Sarah E. Judd, SARAHEJUDD.
And I'll include the links to all of that in the show notes. And by the way, it's the number 4 and not like FOR.
Yes, it is the number 4, not FOR.
And that concludes this week's episode. If you want to learn more about the professional development that we offer at Boot Up PD, you can visit our website, which is bootuppd.org, or click on the link that's in the show notes. Speaking of, if you want to access these show notes, a friendly reminder, it's in the description. Just click on that link in there. Otherwise, just go to jaredoleary.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Next week will be an Unpacking Scholarship episode, and the week after that will be yet another interview.